In late summer, the high Arctic does not darken. The sun circles without setting, casting a steady light across the northern seas. The pack ice drifts slowly between Greenland and Svalbard, shifting with wind and current. There are no permanent settlements this far north. Only seasonal expeditions and the remains of earlier attempts at exploration mark the landscape. North of 80 degrees latitude, the ocean is broken into white plates. Pressure ridges rise where flows collide. Meltwater gathers in shallow pools. Fog moves in from open leads and withdraws again. Sound carries differently here. A distant crack in the ice can seem close. In 1897, this region remained largely uncharted. Maps faded into uncertainty beyond known coastlines. The North Pole had not yet been reached. Nations watched the Arctic with interest, but few men had traveled far across its interior sea. It was into this quiet geography that a hydrogen balloon would rise from Danes Island, on the northwest coast of Spitsbergen. For a brief period, it would drift northward over this moving ocean, carried by wind alone. Nothing in the landscape suggested urgency. The ice moved as it always had. The sky remained clear. Salomon August André was a Swedish engineer born in 1854. He trained in mechanical engineering and worked at the patent office in Stockholm. He was methodical and articulate, and he believed in the practical application of new technologies. In the final decades of the 19th century, ballooning represented progress. Hydrogen balloons had already crossed parts of Europe. André believed the same principles could be applied to the Arctic. By the 1890s, the race to reach the North Pole had become a matter of national prestige. British and American expeditions had pushed north by ship and sledge. None had succeeded. The Arctic Ocean, covered in drifting ice, made traditional travel slow and uncertain. André proposed an alternative. A balloon, guided loosely by drag ropes trailing across the ice, could ride steady southerly winds over the pole and descend on the far side of the Arctic basin. His plan drew attention. Public lectures attracted funding from private donors and the Swedish government. The balloon, named Ornen, the Eagle, was constructed from silk and varnish to reduce hydrogen leakage. It measured approximately 20 meters in diameter and was designed to carry 3 men and their supplies. 2 companions joined him. Niels Strindberg, a physicist and photographer, was 24 years old. He was responsible for meteorological observations and documentation. Knut Frankel, an engineer, replaced an earlier team member shortly before departure. He brought practical experience and physical endurance. The expedition established its base on Danes Island in Svalbard during the summer of 1896, but unfavorable winds delayed the launch. They returned the following year, better supplied and under public scrutiny. Reports were sent back to Sweden describing preparations. The tone remained optimistic. There were concerns. Some meteorologists questioned the reliability of consistent southerly winds. Others noted that hydrogen leakage might reduce lift more quickly than expected. André acknowledged these risks but maintained confidence in his system of guide ropes and steering lines. The stated objective was direct. The balloon would lift from Danes Island, travel north across the Arctic Ocean, pass near or over the North Pole, and eventually descend in Russia or Canada. From there, the men would return by conventional means. It was presented as a rational experiment. The calculations appeared sound. The equipment was modern for its time. The men were prepared for exposure and carried sledges in case of landing. In July 1897, the wind shifted. On July 11, 1897, the wind turned from the south. The balloon hangar on Danes Island had been built to protect Ornen from sudden gusts. For days, the expedition had waited. Weather observations were taken at regular intervals. When the direction aligned with André's plan, preparations moved quickly. Hydrogen filled the envelope. The silk surface tightened as the gas expanded within it. Instruments were secured to the gondola. Provisions, sledges, firearms, cameras, and scientific equipment were loaded carefully to balance weight. Each man carried personal items, including notebooks intended for detailed records of the journey. Shortly after 2:30 in the afternoon, the restraining lines were released. The balloon rose unevenly at first, brushing against the water before lifting clear. Guide ropes trailed below, designed to drag across the surface and slow the craft while offering limited steering control. Within minutes, observers on the island saw that several of these ropes had detached or broken. Ornan drifted northward over open water and ice. The men dropped messages in buoyed canisters, reporting their progress. Early notes described steady movement and moderate altitude. Yet hydrogen began escaping sooner than expected. Moisture and precipitation added weight to the envelope. After approximately 65 hours in the air, the balloon had traveled roughly 300 miles north from its starting point. On July 14, it descended onto the pack ice at approximately 82 degrees 56 minutes north latitude. There was no crash. The landing was controlled, though abrupt. The envelope sagged and lay across the ice. The flight had ended. When Ornan settled onto the ice on July 14, 1897, the men stepped out into a landscape without fixed direction. The balloon lay partially collapsed across uneven floes. The hydrogen envelope, heavy with moisture, no longer held sufficient lift. The guide ropes that had been intended to stabilize flight were gone. The descent had occurred far short of the North Pole, and far from any known settlement. The three men began inventory at once. They unloaded sledges, folding canvas boats, rifles, ammunition, cooking equipment, photographic plates, measuring instruments, and preserved food. The total weight exceeded what three men could comfortably haul. André had anticipated a landing but had assumed it would occur closer to land. Now every object required reconsideration. The first decision was direction. Based on their estimated position, they believed Franz Josef Land to the east offered the nearest known territory. It had been partially charted by earlier expeditions and might provide shelter or cached supplies. The men adjusted their loads accordingly, reducing equipment where possible but retaining essential instruments and records. They moved slowly at first. The surface of the pack ice was irregular. Ridges formed where floes pressed together. Meltwater channels forced detours. Each sledge required coordinated effort to pull across rough sections. The canvas boats were intended for open leads of water, but launching and retrieving them consumed time and strength. Daily progress was measured in miles, sometimes less. Their journals, later recovered, recorded distances carefully. The tone remained factual. They described temperatures, wind conditions, and the shifting orientation of the ice beneath them. Within days, it became clear that the ice itself was drifting southward and westward. Movement during rest hours could erase gains made during the day. What appeared to be forward travel was often offset by the slow motion of the sea beneath the frozen surface. By late July, André revised the plan. Instead of Franz Josef Land, they would aim for Svalbard to the southwest. The decision reflected changing drift patterns and the practical need to shorten distance. The balloon envelope was abandoned. Only essential materials were retained. They had become a sledge expedition, dependent on muscle and endurance. The Arctic remained quiet around them. There were no visible ships, no smoke on the horizon. Only shifting ice and continuous daylight. The journey had entered a new phase. By early August, the expedition had settled into a measured routine. Each morning began with observations. Position was estimated using sextant readings when visibility allowed. Notes were entered into diaries. Equipment was inspected for frost damage and wear. The sledges, each weighing several hundred pounds at the start of the march, were adjusted to balance load. The ice determined their pace. Pressure ridges forced repeated lifting and lowering of the sledges. Sharp edges cut into boots and gloves. When open water blocked the path, the canvas boats were assembled, loaded, and dragged across short crossings. The process required coordination and time. After each passage, everything had to be repacked and secured. They hunted when opportunity appeared. Polar bears and seals provided fresh meat, supplementing preserved rations. The journals describe successful shots and the labor of butchering on unstable ice. Fresh meat improved nutrition and morale, though fuel for cooking remained limited. Blubber was sometimes used to conserve other supplies. Despite discipline, progress remained uncertain. The ice drifted beneath them, sometimes carrying them in directions opposite their intended course. Measurements taken days apart showed displacement that could not be controlled. Forward movement depended not only on effort but on currents below the surface. Weather shifted gradually as summer advanced. Melt pools deepened, then began to refreeze in thinner layers. Fog reduced visibility. At times, the horizon disappeared into uniform white. Their diaries maintained a restrained tone. They recorded distances walked, approximate latitude, and health observations. There was little speculation. The entries suggest concentration on practical tasks rather than reflection. By September, temperatures began to fall more consistently below freezing. Ice hardened. Travel became marginally easier, but daylight slowly lowered in the sky. The men understood that winter would arrive soon. They had covered many miles since July, yet maps offered limited certainty. Their exact location relative to Svalbard shifted with each drift calculation. The Arctic Ocean did not provide fixed reference points. Each evening, tents were pitched on the most stable surface available. Watches were kept for bears. Equipment was dried when possible. The next day's direction was discussed briefly, then sleep followed. The march continued without interruption, measured not by landmarks but by entries in a notebook. As September progressed, the rhythm of travel grew more deliberate. The men reduced unnecessary motion. Each action was planned to conserve energy. Loads had become lighter after weeks of consumption, yet fatigue accumulated. Boots required constant repair. Clothing, stiffened by repeated freezing, was dried over small stoves when fuel allowed. Rations were calculated carefully. Preserved foods included pemmican, biscuits, condensed milk, and tinned goods. Fresh meat from seals and occasional polar bears supplemented these stores. The journals note that seal hunting became essential. Without it, their caloric intake would have declined sharply. They established a system within camp. One prepared food while the others inspected equipment or recorded observations. Instruments were still used when weather permitted. André continued to log position estimates. Strindberg maintained photographic documentation, protecting glass plates from moisture and shock. Sleep patterns adjusted to the changing light. Though the sun no longer circled as high as in July, darkness had not yet returned fully. Temperatures dropped steadily, freezing meltwater pools into uneven crusts that could fracture under weight. Physical strain showed gradually. The diaries mention stiffness and minor injuries but do not dwell on discomfort. Movement remained possible, though slower. Their tone suggested persistence rather than alarm. By early October, they sighted land. White Island, known in Norwegian as Kvitoya, lay ahead through mist and drifting ice. It was largely uncharted and seldom visited. The coastline appeared low and covered with snow. The decision to reach it was practical. Winter travel across open pack ice would soon become impossible. They turned toward the island. In early October 1897, the three men reached the western shore of White Island. The landing was not immediate. Sea ice and shallow water required caution. When they stepped onto firmer ground, the surface felt different from the drifting floes. The island was covered largely by ice cap, with limited exposed terrain along the coast. Snow lay across uneven rock and frozen sand. They selected a site near the shoreline and began constructing a winter shelter. Stones were arranged to form low walls. A canvas covering and portions of their remaining equipment were used to create insulation against wind. The structure was modest, built for necessity rather than comfort. Supplies were stacked carefully inside. Hunting continued when possible. Seal remains were found along the coast, suggesting opportunity for fresh meat. Driftwood was scarce. Fuel remained limited. Their final diary entries described the establishment of this camp in calm terms. The tone remained orderly. Observations were recorded. Dates were marked. After months on moving ice, they had reached fixed ground. Winter approached fully. Darkness would soon return to the Arctic. The journals do not describe fear. They describe preparation. By late October, conditions on White Island became steadily harsher. Temperatures fell below -20 degrees Celsius regularly. Frost accumulated on the canvas shelter. Snowdrifts buried portions of their supplies. Fuel shortages limited the ability to cook or melt ice for water. Hunting remained possible but was unpredictable. Physical strain accumulated. The men's diaries note fatigue, soreness, and minor injuries. Over time, rations diminished. Preserved foods were consumed steadily, but the caloric intake could not fully meet the energy demands of cold and effort. Signs of illness appeared. The journals later recovered indicate weakness and occasional dizziness. Frostbite affected extremities. The three men continued routine tasks, though each day required more effort. Their movement across the island was limited. Psychological strain increased as isolation became absolute. There was no sign of other humans, no passing ships, no news. The Arctic remained unchanged. The men documented wind, ice conditions, and their remaining provisions, maintaining focus on facts rather than speculation. Despite attempts to maintain structure, survival became more tenuous. The combination of cold, dwindling food, and exhaustion slowly overtook their physical capacity. Each step and task demanded greater energy than they could spare. In November 1897, the men's physical condition deteriorated further. Travel on the island ceased entirely. Frostbite advanced, and energy levels fell sharply. Hunting became irregular as movement slowed. Snow and ice blocked access to easy seal carcasses along the shore. Food stores diminished. Fuel ran low, restricting even basic tasks like melting ice for water. The journal entries end in mid-November. Observations indicate that all three men remained together, attempting to maintain shelter, but strength was insufficient for further activity. The Arctic winter settled over White Island, darkness lengthening. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. No rescue was possible. The men died quietly, close to one another, leaving behind notes, instruments, and photographic plates. Time of death cannot be determined precisely, but it likely occurred within weeks of their final diary entries. In 1930, Norwegian sealers searching the region discovered the remains of Andre, Strindberg, and Frankel on White Island. Their tent, partially preserved under snow and ice, contained skeletal remains, diaries, and photographic plates. Instruments and equipment were largely intact. The journals documented the final months of their survival, providing precise observations of route, drift, and weather. Analysis confirmed that the men had died after weeks of exposure, exhaustion, and insufficient food. Their planned return had never been possible. The discovery offered historical closure, establishing the last known location and timeline of the 1897 Arctic expedition. The legacy of the 1897 expedition rests in its record rather than in survival. Photographs, diaries, and instruments preserved in the Arctic offered a clear account of endurance, planning, and miscalculation. They documented months of methodical effort against an environment indifferent to human presence. The Arctic ice kept the story frozen in time, revealing each stage of the journey with factual precision. Today, the Andre expedition serves as a historical record of early polar exploration, illustrating the limits of technology and human endurance at the edge of the known world. Its conclusion is quiet, factual, and permanent. The ice holds the story, and the silence remains.